January 20th, 1961. Robert Francis Kennedy is 35 years old. His brother has just been inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. Robert Kennedy has just been confirmed as Attorney General. He walks into the Department of Justice building on Pennsylvania Avenue and surveys the organization he now commands. He has a list of priorities. He has carried this list in his head for years, sharpened through his work on the McClellan Committee, through thousands of hours of testimony about the structure of organized crime in America, through the specific and personal contempt that he has developed for the men who run that structure. The list is not long. At the top of it is one category, organized crime, and within that category, one name that recurs more often than any other in the files he has been studying. One name that appears at the center of more financial analyses and more organizational charts and more investigative threads than any other single person.
One name that represents more completely than any other exactly the kind of power that Robert Kennedy has decided it is his personal mission to destroy. Meyer Lansky. This is the story of the war that Robert Kennedy declared and Meyer Lansky won. Not by fighting it, by being what he was, by having built, in the decade before the Kennedy Justice Department arrived, an architecture that was specifically designed to survive exactly this kind of assault. By understanding, before Bobby Kennedy understood it himself, that the most dangerous moment in his professional life was coming, and by preparing for it with the same patience and precision that had characterized everything he had ever built. To understand why the Kennedy War on organized crime was different from everything that had come before it, you have to understand what Robert Kennedy brought to the fight that the Offshore Committee and the FBI and the IRS and all the previous investigative efforts had not brought.
He brought will. Absolute, personal, consuming will. This was not a political calculation, or a career move, or an institutional priority handed down from above. This was a personal conviction that had been building for years, and that finally had the full resources of the federal government behind it. Kennedy had first encountered the organized crime world during his years as counsel to the McClellan Committee in the late 1952. He had spent years interviewing witnesses, reviewing documents, sitting across the table from the men who ran the American underworld, and watching them lie with the practiced ease of people who had been lying to investigators their entire careers. He had developed a specific, visceral, documented contempt for what he saw. Not the abstract institutional disapproval of a bureaucrat managing a policy problem. The personal fury of a man who had looked into the eyes of people who corrupted and exploited and operated above the law, and who had found that fury to be clarifying rather than clouding. When he became Attorney General, he reorganized the organized crime and racketeering section of the Justice Department. He tripled its staff. He created specialized units with specific targets and specific mandates. He established direct coordination with the FBI in a way that the previous relationship between the Justice Department and Hoover's Bureau had never achieved. He personally reviewed case files. He held weekly meetings to review progress on specific targets. He was, by every account from the people who worked for him, the most intensely engaged Attorney General that anyone in the Organized Crime Division had ever served under. And his specific intelligence about the structure of organized crime, the intelligence he had accumulated through years of McClellan Committee work, pointed consistently to the same conclusion. The financial architecture that made the entire operation work, the system that moved money from illegal operations through multiple layers of processing into legitimate wealth, had been built and was managed by one person, not a family boss, not a territorial operator, the accountant, the invisible man, Meyer Lansky. Kennedy's investigators built a specific file on Meyer Lansky that was different from the FBI's file in one important respect. Where the FBI's file was primarily organizational, documenting relationships and associations and the structure of the syndicate,
Kennedy's file was primarily financial. It focused on the specific mechanisms through which illegal revenue was converted to legitimate wealth, on the offshore architecture that had been partially traced through previous investigations, on the specific transactions and entities that could be identified as components of the system. It was the most thorough financial investigation of Meyer Lansky's operations that had ever been assembled. It was also, ultimately, insufficient. Not because it was poorly done, because the architecture it was trying to penetrate had been built specifically to defeat exactly this kind of investigation. The offshore layer was behind legal walls that the Kennedy Justice Department's authority did not extend to penetrating. The domestic layer had been structured with enough legal distance between the illegal revenue and the visible assets to prevent the specific legal mechanism of tax evasion charges from being straightforwardly applied. The organizational layer presented the problem that had defeated every previous investigator, which was that Meyer Lansky's role in the syndicate was central, but not officially documented in any form that created legally usable evidence. Meyer Lansky, watching the Kennedy Justice Department mobilize against his world from the position he always occupied, did what he always did. He assessed. He understood what was coming and what it was capable of and what it was not capable of. He made adjustments to the architecture where adjustments were warranted. He did not panic, and he did not flee, and he did not make the kinds of errors under pressure that destroyed other people when pressure arrived in this concentrated form. He was also not passive. The decade of the 1960 seconds, the decade when Kennedy's organized crime war was at its most intense, is the decade when Meyer Lansky made some of his most significant adjustments to the offshore financial architecture. The relationships with Swiss and Bahamian banking institutions were deepened and formalized in ways that added additional layers of legal protection. New jurisdictions were added to the network as they developed their financial services infrastructure. The nominee structures were restructured in ways that increased the legal distance between beneficial ownership and visible documentation. Each of these moves was, in part, a response to the specific intelligence about the Kennedy investigation that Meyer Lansky was receiving through his own channels. Because Meyer Lansky had his own intelligence operation, not a formal organization, but a network of relationships with people in positions that gave him advance warning of specific investigative moves. Lawyers who had access to information about grand jury proceedings. Former law enforcement officials who knew how specific investigations were being conducted. Political contacts who understood what was coming through official channels before it arrived. This network was not unique to the Kennedy period. Meyer Lansky had been maintaining it for decades. What was unique about the Kennedy period was the intensity of the investigation it was designed to monitor. The Kennedy Justice Department brought grand jury proceedings. These are among the most powerful investigative tools available to federal prosecutors. Grand juries can compel testimony from witnesses who cannot invoke the Fifth Amendment to avoid answering questions, if the questions concern areas where the witnesses have been granted immunity from prosecution. The Kennedy investigators used this tool aggressively, calling witnesses who had knowledge of specific aspects of Meyer Lansky's operations and who were given immunity in exchange for their testimony. What the grand jury proceedings produced was extensive testimony about the general shape of the financial architecture. Witnesses described the offshore layer in terms that reflected genuine knowledge of its existence and general structure. They described specific transactions that had passed through specific entities in specific jurisdictions. The picture that emerged from the accumulated testimony was the most detailed portrait of the offshore system that any official proceeding had ever assembled. It was not, however, sufficient to sustain an indictment on charges that would have exposed the full architecture and produced a conviction. The testimony established the existence of the system in general terms. It did not establish specific transactions in the specific detail that criminal prosecution required. The gap between knowing and proving, which Meyer Lansky had spent 20 years designing his operations to create, held even under the most intense investigative pressure the American government had ever applied to his specific case. Kennedy was frustrated.
The accounts of people who worked with him during this period describe an attorney general who was uncharacteristically willing to express personal frustration with the pace of the Lansky investigation. Who reviewed the financial analyses and the grand jury transcripts and the investigative summaries with the focused unhappiness of a man who can see exactly what he is looking for and cannot get his hands on it? Who asked, in meetings with his organized crime division staff, versions of the same question in different forms? What are we missing? Why can we not prove what we know? What does this man have that the others did not have? The answer to those questions was architectural. Meyer Lansky had built something that the legal system of 1961 and 1962 and 1963 was not equipped to penetrate. The offshore banking secrecy laws that protected the most critical layer of his architecture existed in jurisdictions that were sovereign states with their own legal systems, and those legal systems did not cooperate with American criminal investigations in the specific ways that the Kennedy investigators needed. The legal framework for the kind of international financial cooperation that would have cracked the Swiss and Bahamian layers did not exist in the early 1960 seconds. Kennedy could not build that framework quickly enough to use it against the specific case he was working on. He tried other approaches. The Las Vegas connection was one of them. The casino skimming operations that moved money from Las Vegas casino operations into the offshore architecture were the most domestically visible component of the system, and they were the component where the physical evidence of the illegal diversion was most accessible. Casino employees who had participated in the skimming operations were identified and approached. Some of them cooperated. Their testimony described a systematic skimming operation at multiple Las Vegas properties, with the skimmed cash being packaged and transported in ways that were documented well enough to establish the operation existed. What the Las Vegas investigation could not fully establish was the next link in the chain. The cash that was skimmed from the casinos was handled by specific individuals before it disappeared into the offshore architecture. Those individuals, when they could be found and compelled to testify, could describe what they received and who they handed it to. The people they handed it to were another link in a chain that was specifically designed to prevent any single link from knowing where the chain ended. The trail went cold at the same point where it had always gone cold, which was the edge of the offshore layer. November 22nd, 1963. Dallas. The assassination of President Kennedy changed everything. Robert Kennedy went from being the most powerful law enforcement official in America, the man personally directing the most intensive, organized crime investigation in American history, to being a grieving brother in a private citizen's position. He remained Attorney General for another several months under President Johnson, but the relationship between the surviving Kennedy and the new administration was uncomfortable, and the specific priorities of the Kennedy Justice Department were not Lyndon Johnson's priorities in the same personal way they had been Robert Kennedy's. The organized crime war did not end immediately. The institutional momentum of the Kennedy years produced prosecutions and convictions and structural changes to the organized crime landscape that persisted for years. But the personal intensity that had driven the operation at its peak was gone. The man whose individual will had been its primary fuel was gone from the position that had given that will its extraordinary leverage. Meyer Lansky watched this transition with the attention he applied to everything. He understood what it meant. The specific threat that had been the most dangerous in his professional lifetime, the threat of an attorney general who combined genuine intelligence about the architecture of his operations with the personal will and the institutional resources to pursue it without constraint, was diminished. It would return in different forms in subsequent administrations, but the Kennedy version, the most dangerous version, was over. He was 61 years old in 1963. He had survived the most intensive organized crime investigation in American history without a conviction. The offshore architecture had held. The domestic evidence had been insufficient. The grand jury proceedings had produced knowledge without proof.
The Las Vegas investigation had found the skimming without finding the chain that connected it to the offshore layer. Robert Kennedy ran for the Senate from New York in 1964 and won. He spent the next several years in the Senate, building the political base for what many believed would be a presidential campaign in 1968. He maintained his interest in organized crime issues, but without the specific executive authority that had made his Justice Department period so effective. He was a senator. He could investigate and he could legislate, but he could not direct prosecutions with the personal intensity that had characterized his years as Attorney General. In 1968, he announced his presidential candidacy. He was 42 years old. He had energy and magnetism and the specific kind of political appeal that combined his brother's legacy with his own harder-edged commitment to the fights he had chosen. He was winning. The California primary in June 1968 was a significant victory, and the momentum of the campaign suggested that the Democratic nomination and possibly the presidency were within reach. On June 5, 1968, Robert Kennedy was shot at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. He died the following morning. He was 42 years old. The war he had declared on organized crime, the war that he had been planning to resume from the White House if he won the presidency, died with him. Meyer Lansky was 66 years old when Robert Kennedy died. He had known for 5 years, since the Dallas assassination, that the specific threat Kennedy represented had been diminished. He had watched the political career of the surviving Kennedy brother with the attention of someone who understood that a Kennedy presidency would mean a resumption of the personal war that had been the most dangerous episode of his professional life. When that presidency became impossible, Meyer Lansky absorbed the information the way he absorbed everything, completely, quietly, and went back to work. He lived another 15 years, dying in 1983 at 80. The offshore architecture he had spent decades building continued to function. The money the Kennedy investigators had come closer than anyone else to tracing remained untouched, unseized, invisible. The war that Robert Kennedy had declared and prosecuted with more intelligence and more personal intensity than any law enforcement official before or after him had not produced the victory it sought. The specific irony of the Kennedy-Lansky confrontation is the irony of a man who had the intelligence, the will, and the resources to do what needed to be done, facing an architecture that had been specifically built to defeat exactly those qualities. Kennedy was smart. The architecture was smarter, in the specific sense that it had been designed in advance for exactly the threat Kennedy represented, while Kennedy was responding to what the architecture had already become. He was always one step behind, chasing something that had been built to stay one step ahead of exactly the pursuit he was conducting. The war ended without a final battle. One combatant was killed in a hotel kitchen. The other died in a hospital bed, old and intact, and never convicted 11 years later. The architecture stands. The money was never found. Bobby's war ended the way wars end when one side has prepared more thoroughly and more patiently than the other. Not with a dramatic resolution, with an absence. The presence of what was never seized, never exposed, never brought to account. The permanent, invisible architecture of a man who knew the war was coming and built his defenses before it arrived. If this story of the most personal and most consequential legal battle in American organized crime history, of the Kennedy who came closest and still could not reach what he was looking for, moved you, subscribe to this channel. Because the full story of how Meyer Lansky survived the most powerful family in American politics is the story of what preparation and patience can accomplish against even the most formidable opposition. Drop a comment. Tell me whether you think a Kennedy presidency would have finally broken the architecture. And remember this: the best defense against power is a system so well designed that power has nothing to grip. There is a dimension of the Kennedy-Lansky confrontation that most accounts miss entirely. It is the dimension of mutual recognition, of two men who, across the legal and institutional distance that separated them, understood each other with a completeness that their respective allies did not. Kennedy understood Meyer Lansky in a way that previous investigators had not understood him, because Kennedy's preparation had been deeper and his intelligence about the architecture more thorough. He understood, in a way that Kefauver had not fully understood, that the challenge was not organizational but architectural, that the target was not the relationships and the territories, but the financial system that made those relationships sustainable, that the way to break the syndicate was not to prosecute the bosses, but to collapse the financial architecture that processed and protected the boss's wealth. He understood, in other words, exactly what Meyer Lansky was, and why that specific thing was the critical target. This understanding was accurate. It was also, from Kennedy's perspective, infuriating, because understanding what the architecture was did not tell him how to penetrate it. The legal tools available to him in 1961 were not built for the specific architecture he was confronting. The international legal cooperation mechanisms that would have allowed him to reach the offshore layer did not exist. The domestic evidence was insufficient. He could see the target with unusual clarity and could not reach it. Meyer Lansky understood Kennedy with similar clarity. He understood that the Attorney General was different in kind from previous investigators, that the combination of genuine intelligence about the architecture, personal will to pursue it, and institutional resources to deploy that will constituted a threat of a different order than anything he had faced before. He had faced smart investigators before. He had faced determined investigators before. He had not previously faced someone who combined both qualities with the specific executive authority of the nation's chief law enforcement officer and the personal backing of the President of the United States. He adjusted accordingly. The architectural adjustments of the early 1960 seconds were specifically calibrated to the Kennedy threat as Meyer Lansky assessed it. Not reactive, not panicked, but deliberate and specific responses to the specific capabilities of the specific investigation being conducted against him. He knew, through his intelligence network, what the Kennedy investigators were focusing on. He knew the Las Vegas investigation was intensifying. He knew the grand jury was producing testimony that described the general shape of the offshore architecture. He made adjustments that increased the legal protection of the most vulnerable components without restructuring the whole. This is the dynamic that makes the Kennedy-Lansky confrontation the most sophisticated episode in the history of American law enforcement's engagement with organized crime. It is the confrontation between the most capable investigator who ever came after Meyer Lansky and the most carefully built architecture that any organized crime figure ever constructed. Both sides were operating at the highest level available to them. One side was working within the constraints of the law and the institutional structures of American government. The other was working without those constraints and had been doing so for 30 years. The law was a constraint for the investigator and a tool for the architect. That asymmetry was decisive. Kennedy knew it was decisive. The accounts of his private conversations during the organized crime investigation period, particularly in the months before the Dallas assassination, describe an attorney general who was willing to acknowledge, in private, that the specific legal framework available to him was inadequate to the specific problem he was addressing. Who was talking about legislative changes that would create new tools for international financial cooperation? who understood that the long-term solution required building the legal framework that the offshore architecture had been designed to exploit. He was thinking 5 years ahead. He was building toward a set of legislative and institutional changes that would have changed the landscape of the confrontation. The Dallas assassination stopped that project. The legislative changes that Kennedy was contemplating, the international banking cooperation frameworks that would have been their centerpiece, were not implemented in the form or on the timeline that a Kennedy Justice Department or a Kennedy White House would have pursued them. They arrived eventually, in fragmentary form, over the following 3 decades, too late to affect the specific case that had motivated them. There is a document in the Kennedy Justice Department files, partially declassified, that captures the inner logic of the Kennedy-Lansky confrontation more precisely than anything else in the public record. It is an internal memorandum written by one of Kennedy's senior organized crime investigators, dated sometime in late 1962, reviewing the progress of the investigation and assessing the prospects for prosecution. The memo is candid in a way that internal government documents rarely are. It acknowledges that the Lansky investigation has produced the most comprehensive financial portrait of an organized crime figure ever assembled by the Justice Department, and that this portrait, while establishing beyond reasonable doubt the subject's central role in the Syndicate's financial architecture, does not meet the evidentiary standard required for the specific charges that would expose and dismantle the architecture. The memo describes what it calls the architecture problem. The problem is that the financial architecture has been specifically designed so that no single component of it, viewed in isolation, is provably illegal under current law. The cash businesses are legal businesses. The casino operations have gaming licenses and file tax returns. The offshore accounts are in jurisdictions where their existence is not illegal, and their contents are legally protected from inquiry. The nominee structures are legal corporate arrangements. The loan-back mechanisms are documented business transactions. Each piece is defensible. The whole is the crime. But prosecuting the whole requires establishing connections between the pieces that the architecture was specifically designed to prevent establishing. This is the architectural genius that the memo is trying to document. Not the individual components, but the system. The way the components are connected in a sequence that is individually innocuous and collectively criminal. The memo ends with a recommendation that the Justice Department pursue legislative changes to create new legal tools for prosecuting exactly this kind of systemic financial crime. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Statute, RICO, which would not be enacted until 1970, is the direct descendant of exactly the legislative thinking that this 1962 memo represents. RICO was built, in significant part, to address the architecture problem that Kennedy's investigators encountered in the Lansky investigation. Meyer Lansky never faced a RICO prosecution. He died in 1983, and by then his operations had been through sufficient restructuring and the offshore architecture had been through sufficient refinement that even RICO, the legislative tool that Kennedy's investigation had helped motivate, would have faced the same fundamental challenges that defeated the Kennedy investigation itself. The architecture evolved to stay ahead of the tools designed to penetrate it. That is what architectures built by intelligent people do. Kennedy's lasting contribution to the war against organized crime is the institutional legacy, the reorganized Justice Department, the intensive investigation methodology, the legislative framework that his thinking helped produce, the demonstration that organized crime could be a primary priority of the federal government rather than a secondary concern. His personal failure is the specific one this story is about. He never broke the architecture. The most capable and most determined enemy Meyer Lansky ever faced did not find what he was looking for. The specific encounter between them, in the formal sense, is documented in the grand jury testimony that Meyer Lansky gave in connection with the Kennedy investigations. He was called. He appeared. He answered what he was required to answer. He gave nothing that could be used. He walked out as he had walked in. The specific exchange between Kennedy's investigators and Meyer Lansky that is most revealing is the exchange that did not produce usable evidence. The blank spaces in the transcript were questions received legally adequate but investigatively empty answers. The architecture functioning exactly as designed at the moment of its most serious test. Kennedy went to his death convinced, by all accounts, that the architecture existed and that its architect was the most important unresolved case of his Justice Department years. He never had the chance to resume the pursuit from the White House. The architecture outlived the war. The war ended. The architect continued. The invisible empire remained invisible, and the man who built it, who had seen the most dangerous enemy of his professional life come and go without touching what mattered, went back to doing what he had always done, quietly, patiently, precisely, for another 15 years, until the day he died. Consider the specific geography of the Kennedy-Lansky confrontation. On one side, the Department of Justice building on Pennsylvania Avenue, the most powerful law enforcement institution in the world, staffed by hundreds of investigators and prosecutors and analysts, backed by the full resources of the federal government and the personal authority of the president's brother. On the other side, a small man in a modest apartment who walked his dog in the morning and ate at the same restaurant and read the newspaper and appeared, to any observer without access to the classified files, to be a retired businessman of modest means living an entirely ordinary life. The disproportion between the visible resources of the two sides and the actual outcome of the confrontation is the central fact of this story. Kennedy had everything. Meyer Lansky appeared to have nothing. Kennedy could not find what he was looking for. The invisible empire remained invisible. The man with the power of the federal government behind him spent 3 years pursuing the man with no visible power and came away without the conviction he sought. This is not because Kennedy was inadequate. He was not. He was, by every measure, the most capable and most determined adversary that Meyer Lansky ever faced. It is because the architecture had been built before the adversary arrived, and building before the adversary arrives is always the decisive advantage in a defensive contest. Meyer Lansky had been building his defenses since the 1,940 seconds. Kennedy arrived in 1,961. The architecture had a 20-year head start. The lesson that organized crime investigators drew from the Kennedy experience was eventually translated into the legislative changes that produced RICO and the international financial cooperation frameworks that developed over the following decades. The lesson that Meyer Lansky drew from the Kennedy experience was simpler and more direct. His architecture had been tested at maximum pressure and had held. The most dangerous enemy he was ever likely to face had come and gone without breaking through. The design was correct. The system worked. He spent the last 20 years of his life, from 1963 to 1983, doing exactly what he had always done: walking his dog, eating at his restaurant, reading the newspaper, maintaining the invisible architecture that no investigator had ever managed to fully penetrate, watching the world change around him, watching the legal and regulatory landscape evolve in ways that Kennedy's investigation had helped motivate, watching new tools arrive that were designed for architectures like his, and making the adjustments that kept the architecture functional in the new environment. He was not invulnerable. The Las Vegas skimming prosecution of the early 1970 seconds was a serious threat that required years of legal effort to defeat. The Israel rejection of 1972 was a personal wound that he carried the rest of his life. The FBI surveillance was continuous, and occasionally produced results that required response. But he survived all of it. He died in his own bed. He was never convicted of anything serious. The architecture was never fully exposed. The money was never fully found. Bobby's war ended on June 6, 1968, in a hospital in Los Angeles, with the death of the man who had fought it most personally and most effectively. It ended without the resolution that Robert Kennedy had believed was achievable and had been working toward with all the resources of the most powerful law enforcement office in the world. It ended with the architecture intact, and the architect still at work, and the invisible empire still invisible, and the $300 million still somewhere in the structures that no investigation had ever managed to fully trace. The best defense is not the one that fights back. It is the one that the attacker cannot find a grip on. Meyer Lansky built that defense. Bobby Kennedy threw everything he had at it. For 3 years, the most capable adversary in the history of American law enforcement's engagement with organized crime pursued the most carefully built financial architecture in that same history. The architecture held. The war ended. The architect survived. That is Bobby's war. That is its final accounting. One last thing deserves to be said about what the Kennedy-Lansky confrontation reveals about the nature of the contest between law and the specific kind of intelligence that Meyer Lansky represented. Robert Kennedy believed that the law, properly resourced and properly directed, could reach anything. This belief was genuine, and it was honorable, and it was, in the specific case of organized crime in 1961, functionally correct for every target except one. Kennedy's Justice Department prosecuted and convicted organized crime figures across the country. It built cases that sent bosses to prison and dismantled operations that had run for decades. The organized crime war was not a failure in general. It was remarkably successful in general. The specific failure was Meyer Lansky. And the specific failure happened because Meyer Lansky had spent his entire professional life taking the law seriously in a way that most of his contemporaries had not. Most organized crime figures treated the law as an obstacle to be corrupted or avoided or overpowered. Meyer Lansky treated it as a system to be understood and designed around. He had studied the law the way an engineer studies the specifications for a structure he is designing against. He knew the law's capabilities and its limits. He knew where its authority ended and the authority of other jurisdictions began. He knew the specific evidentiary standards required for specific charges, and he structured his operations so that those standards could never be met. This is why Kennedy, who understood the law better than almost anyone, and who had more of its resources at his disposal than anyone before him, could not break the architecture. Because the architecture was built by someone who understood the law as well as Kennedy did, and had used that understanding to make the architecture invulnerable to exactly the tools that Kennedy had available. It was a fair fight between two men who both understood the rules. One of them had been playing longer and had built his defenses before the other arrived. That is all. That was enough. Meyer Lansky died in 1983. Robert Kennedy died in 1968. The architecture outlived them both. It is in the system somewhere still, or in what the system has become over 40 more years of operation. The war is over. The architect won. Not by being stronger, by being earlier, by understanding before his adversary arrived what his adversary would bring, and building his defense accordingly. The most complete expression of what it means to win a war before it starts.